Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to another episode. I am excited to be here today. And, my jam is communication. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the three things that most people miss that makes their communication less effective. So you may be walking around and you may feel like, well, I communicate pretty well. And most people probably do feel like they communicate fairly well. And the fact is, most people communicate well enough. And what I mean by that is well enough to, say, get a point across, well enough for someone to understand the general idea of what they need or want. But if you think about it, we were not really taught how to communicate. And we certainly weren't taught how to communicate effectively, not explicitly. A lot of what we learned in our communication was implicit. It was learned by observing others, it was learned by our interactions. And I think, suffice it to say that if you look at the world and the way we communicate with each other, we probably haven't had the best models unless you have had a person in your life who is a communicator as a profession. And when I mean that, like a professional communicator, a person who taught communication, a person who maybe even in the therapeutic profession where there's a sense of what is effective in communicating. And so, but by and large, most of us probably weren't taught how to communicate effectively. So I just wanted to bring some very quick tips on what is it that people miss that can make our communication less effective. Right. So the first thing that one can miss is the way you listen. And if you think about it, most people they listen to what the words that are coming out of one's mouth, right? So they may be hearing the words they hear, but they may not be listening. They may be listening to understand the context and to understand, to process the content, but they may be missing some things in that listening. So how we mostly listen to respond. And there are, when I do my listening talks, there are a couple of other ways that are unconscious in our listening filter system that we listen. But mostly we're listening to respond. And when we're listening to respond, we're actually not listening to the person and what they're communicating. We're actually listening to the responses in our head, right? So we're hearing bits and pieces of the communication, maybe even a little out of context since we're not actually listening with our whole selves. And we're responding to bits and pieces of the communication, meaning that we're missing the rest of what's being said or what's being communicated, whether verbally or non-verbally. And so a lot of misunderstanding comes from that, exactly, comes from a person latching on to a particular word, to a particular phrase, to a particular element of the words that are being spoken and missing the whole context, and then therefore and then not clarifying, right? Not clarifying. But and so in that sense, the miscommunication can occur. And what's heard is heard, right? What's internalized is what's internalized, may not be the full communication. So that's one of the big things that people miss that can make the communication less effective. It's the listening. It's the way that you listen. Now, the second thing that happens or that people may not be aware of is the kinds of pictures, or what I call internal representations, that you're creating in others' minds. So, when we think in pictures primarily, and when you are speaking, you have a picture in your mind of what you're trying to communicate. You may not be fully aware of the picture in your mind, like now that you're hearing, you might become aware, like, oh yeah, I have a picture of what I'm trying to communicate. So it happens so quickly though. We form what we want to say in a picture first, and then our brain processes it rapidly, and then we encode it into words. Now oftentimes we're not really aware of how we're creating the pictures congruent with the words congruent with the pictures that are in our mind. We go based on our historical way of communicating, right? And somewhat on the emotions that we're feeling. And so we may not always communicate clearly the emotion, communicate clearly the message, and keeping in mind that the person who's listening has an entirely other context, an entire other um, filtering system, listening filter system that your words are going to feed through. So it's useful to learn how to communicate mindfully, to communicate in the ways that um, help you to be able to put the picture that's you're thinking in your mind that you're trying to communicate into the mind of the person who is the listener or the listeners, right? That is why when I teach my full communication course, the Communication That Transforms course, we talk about something called representational systems. And that's how primarily how people represent language. And we represent language through visual, through auditory, through kinesthetic, through gustatory, through smell. Like we represent language because 7% of language, only 7% of language is words. And I know if you listen to me, you've heard me say this multiple times. If you've heard me speak on stages, you've heard me say this multiple times, but I'll say it over and over because it's so important that people that 7% of words is communication, right? And so when we think about as we're communicating words, and we're not thinking about the pictures, the pictures that we're forming in our minds with the rest of our communication, with our kinesthetic, with our like our body language, with our tone of voice, with the rapidity or the velocity of our speaking. So when you are speaking to someone, they're hearing you in a particular way, and that's forming a picture in their mind of what you're saying. And a lot of times we miss that. We miss that entire process of what's the image that's in my mind that I'm intending to communicate. And when we speak, how is that image actually showing up? And we can never know because guess what? We're not in other people's minds, right? And so it's not that I'm asking you to mind read, but to be aware that the picture that you're trying to communicate may be different from the picture that's actually landing. And there's a way to find that out. And it's simply to ask. It's simply to clarify, what did you hear me say? Or is that clear? Or what are your thoughts about that? And when they begin to speak back to you, clarifying what they heard, you will know how close of a picture that you painted in their mind from what you were intending to communicating. Guess what? Guess what? If the picture doesn't match, that's your opportunity to clarify again. I was speaking in front of a room recently and I was communicating some instruction. And there was someone in the room who didn't understand what I would, the way that I was giving the instruction. And so what I had to do was kind of get from from this person, from him, what is it specifically that he didn't understand so I could get an idea of the picture that he was creating that didn't match the picture that I was intending to create. And from there, I was able to re-explain, create a clearer picture. He asked another clarifying question. Once again, I answered, and boom, the pictures matched. And oftentimes we don't take the time to do that type of clarification and negotiation to make sure the picture of what we're trying to communicate lands as the similar or the very similar or same picture as the person is building in their mind as they're listening. So that is the second thing. Now, the third thing is that most people don't have the flexibility of listening or speaking to navigate different challenging circumstances effectively, right? So a lot of times we either don't have the capacity to emotionally regulate or we don't have the flexibility of language, different questions to ask, or the listening, expanded listening, to be able to navigate those challenging systems. A lot of times when we get stuck, it activates that survival response. There can be like a threat, a perceived threat to one's, whether it's intelligence or effectiveness or whatever the case may be. And when that happens, we get bristled and we lose our sense of skills, our skill sets that we normally have to communicate. And so, one of the things that I teach when I work with leaders and I work with organizations, and in my communication that transforms course, is how do you expand that flexibility? What are the skills of regulation, the skills of listening, and the skills to know how to ask those clarifying questions, to skills to know how to go back and forth. What are the specific questions that you need to ask to be able to glean, how to be able to um, match those representations and to get the response that you need to get to response to be able to communicate effectively and to navigate those challenging and maybe even conflicting circumstances. So those are the three things that people can miss that make their communication less effective. And what I want to say about that is that, communication is an ongoing learning. No matter how much work you've done, no matter how well you communicate or how well you think you communicate or how well people have told you you communicate, there is always expansion to be done. And so that's why I do the work that I do. Even I am always expanding my communication. I'm always reading books and taking seminars. And as I've been doing this work for well over a decade and teaching it for well over a decade. And yet I still am an eternal learner because I have to be able to pass these skills on to the leaders in organizations that I consult with and that I teach. And it's fun. It's fun to be able to discover all the ways our brain works so that we can really connect with people in ways that maybe we hadn't thought we could before. So I want you to take these and think, start to like contemplate, how am I communicating? How am I listening? How am I listening? Am I waiting to respond? How am I creating internal representations in other people's minds? And how am I um, how will I increase my flexibility of listening and of response? All right. So you can see amazing changes in your work when you incorporate this, your personal relationships, your leadership, your confidence, and make major positive change in your organization when you bring this work into your organization as development, or the deeper dive into learning the tools. And that's what I do, and that's what I teach. I help leaders create cultures where their employees feel seen, heard, respected, valued, and welcome so that organization and everyone in it can thrive. So, if you are a leader and you're committed to bringing psych safety as a topic of growth and development to your organization, let's talk. I'd love to come and speak at your next meeting, conference, ERG, program, or leadership retreat. All right. And finally, as always, I am committed to seeing you empowered because you all are the bridge to the future, to the next generation, to empowered and resilient leaders. You're the bridge to a new future. So, with that, I will see you on our next episode. And until then, stay empowered.